a few more folks to arrive.
Got it.
All right, so it's just after 9. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 4th meeting of the Farm and Forest Modernization Program Rulemaking Advisory Committee. So this morning, we are going to start by spending a few minutes on introductions, briefly, and then I'm going to take a moment to review our charge in order to orient us again to the goal for this meeting and our rulemaking in general. And then for most of this morning, we are going to be discussing what we are calling the multi-path permitting topic. All right, and I was going to spend some time orienting us to that particular topic before we get into it as well. We're going to take a quick break sort of after about an hour and a half. And then for the last 45 minutes, we are going to be discussing methodologies for alignment of a rectangle that is a technical part of a template test for a forest dwelling. So why don't we kick off with a really quick round of introductions this morning, more like a roll call. So just your name and organization that you represent today. So I'll go ahead and start. So I am Hillary Foote. I am the current Farm and Forest Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation Development, and I am providing support generally for this Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And also, we'll go ahead and start with introductions of our other key DLCD staff who are supporting this process. So we have Gordon Howard.
Hello, everyone. Gordon Howard, the Community Services Division Manager. Welcome.
And Casaria Taylor, who's providing administrative support for this process, as well
Hi,
as...
good morning, everyone. Casaria Taylor, Senior Rules Coordinator for the agency.
Great, thank you. And we also have with us our Commission Liaison, Barbara Boyer.
Good morning, Barbara Boyer, farmer out of Willamette Valley.
Right. And now I'm just going to go through the Rulemaking Advisory Committee list alphabetically and go ahead and introduce yourself, and good morning to you. All right, so Alyssa Bowles. Is Alyssa with us this morning? No, okay. Amber?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amber Bell, Planning Director with Lane County.
Good morning, Amber. And Austin? Let's see. Austin, are you with us this morning? No. Okay. Blair?
Hi, I'm Blair Batson. I'm a staff attorney with 1000 Friends of Oregon.
And Charles?
Hello, I just had a little technical difficulty, but I got it fixed. Charles Bennett, Jackson County. I assume we're just introducing ourselves.
Yes, we are. We are kind of going through introductions almost like a roll call this morning because we have a lot to cover today. So Olivia, instead of Elaine, I believe, is an alternate for wine growers.
Yeah, that's right. Olivia Jamin here with Oregon Wine Association.
Okay. And Ken Katzeroff.
Good morning, Ken Katzeroff. I'm Land Use Attorney at Schwab, Williamson and Wyatt.
Great. Good morning. And Jim Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Jim Johnson, Oregon Department of Agriculture.
All right. Good morning. And Jan Lee?
Yes, Jan Lee. I'm with OACD and also a board member at Clackamas Soil and Water.
Great, welcome. And Jeff Kleinman.
Good morning, Jeff Kleinman, attorney in private practice.
Right, welcome. And Joy, is Joy with us this morning? Joy may be on maternity leave for Department of Fish and Wildlife. All right. And Justin Green.
Good morning, Justin Green, former air and water regulator, environmental consultant.
Great, welcome. Good morning. And Catherine Daniels. Catherine with us this morning? No. Okay.
She is here. She's not coming off of mute though.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Casaria. Catherine, did you want to unmute?
Chat is disabled as well. I don't know if we usually have that open.
Oh, we do usually. Casaria, could you address chat? And Catherine, if you're having an issue with that, drop a note to Casaria in the chat once it's enabled. All right, and Lauren Poor. Is Lauren with us this morning? Or are we having technical issues? Okay. And Maitri?
Morning, I'm Maitri Sinha. I'm the Senior Rural Planner with Washington County.
Thank you for joining us. I know you need to leave a little bit early today, so appreciate you taking some time this morning. And Megan.
Good morning, Megan Dobchevsky, Planning Manager with Umatilla County.
Great, it's great to have you here. And Mike McCarty.
Mike McCarthy Family Farm, and also I'm a member of Ag for Oregon.
Great, welcome this morning. And Mickey.
Mickey Killinger, Simple Shepherd in Central Oregon.
Great, good morning, Mickey. And Nellie McAdams.
Hi everyone, Nellie McAdams with Oregon Agricultural Trust.
Great, welcome this morning. And Rob Halliburton.
Hi, I'm Rob Halliburton with Friends of Yamhill County.
Welcome. And Rory.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rory Isbell. I'm a staff attorney and our Rural Lands Program Manager at Central Oregon Land Watch.
Great, thank you for being with us this morning. And Samantha Bear.
Hi, Samantha Bear with the Oregon Property Owners Association.
Hey, good morning and thank you for joining.
Good morning. Hey Hillary, it looks like some folks maybe didn't get the link, so I'm forwarding to Lauren and others. I'm not sure what happened. But
right,
they'll be coming on.
Okay, great. Thank you. So wait, maybe just one moment. And Tyler. We have Tyler Ernst this morning. Oh, okay. And did anybody join a little bit later that I did not call on yet?
Yeah, we've got Austin from Marion County here. Hi, everyone.
Great. Thank you for joining us this morning, Austin.
And Hillary, it looks like Catherine is off mute now.
Okay. Great. Catherine, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, Catherine Daniels, former DLCD Farm and Forest Land Specialist.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
And Hillary, I believe Silas has joined us, our new
okay.
staff person.
Well, I see two more DLCD
Hello.
folks on the phone today. So it's Silas.
Hello, nice to meet you. Silas, Grant Periodic Review Specialist.
And thank you for joining us. And Aurora. Aurora, are you available to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I was having difficulties coming off mute. But hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Aurora Chettle, she, her pronouns, and I'm a legislative and policy analyst here at the department.
Thank you for joining us. And Lauren, I see you're able to get on. Apologies for any technical confusion this morning.
Yeah, good morning, Lauren Poor, Oregon Farm Bureau. Sorry, I did not get any of the materials or stuff for this meeting today.
That's very strange. We'll go ahead and forward that to you. It's posted on the website as well, if you would like to pull it up. All right, is there anybody else who didn't get called on during introductions who would like to take a moment to introduce themselves? I think that's everybody. All right. So I really appreciate that we have a great group representing a wide variety of perspectives here today. And again, we've said this before, but you are all selected to participate on this Rules Advisory Committee because we do want to hear from you. And we are encouraging members as well as folks who may be following along online to go ahead and submit written comments to the department. So if something occurs to you after the meeting, or you didn't feel comfortable speaking up, or you want to ensure that your comments are clear to the department, go ahead and send written materials on any of the topics that we've covered so far. You're also welcome to schedule a call with me or Gordon to discuss concerns or issues that you have. So these written clarifications that we have received have been very helpful. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that. If you haven't provided written comments, what we are going to be considering is the perspectives as they've been provided in these meetings, which are described in the meeting notes that are posted. So you may want to take another look at those notes to ensure that we've accurately captured your comments and concerns if you haven't also provided written materials. And this is going to be particularly important right now, as after this meeting, staff will be re-reviewing all of these materials and preparing rule language proposal, which we will be discussing at our July meeting. So again, thank you for volunteering so much of your time and putting a lot of effort into the feedback that you've provided to the department over the past couple months. And again, before we move into discussion, I want to revisit what our commission has asked us to do for this rulemaking. So I'm just going to read our charge for this portion and today out loud again, so we're all on the same page about that. So the charge that we've been given, members of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee will provide assistance to agency staff to analyze, draft, and recommend Oregon administrative rules related to the implementation of Goal 3 agricultural lands and Goal 4 forest lands, and recommend Oregon administrative rules to reduce regulatory confusion, to improve clarity, and to facilitate implementation of standards by counties. So Oregon administrative rules staff recommend for consideration by the commission will clarify whether uses otherwise listed in Chapter 215 of statute or in OAR 660.006.0025, which are the forest rules, may or may not alternatively be reviewed as home occupations under 215.213 sub 2, 215.283 sub 2, or OAR 660.006.0025, section 4 sub S. And also clarify whether uses otherwise allowed in Chapter 215 of statute may or may not alternatively be reviewed as commercial activities in conjunction with farm use under 215.213 sub 2N or 215.283 sub 2I, unless otherwise allowed in statute. The second half, again, we're going to be considering later today, is rulemaking to define in OAR 660.006.0027 a replicable methodology to align a template rectangle with a streamer road, clarify what constitutes a road for purposes of the review, and the term maximum extent possible. So those are the issues that we're going to be discussing today. And, particularly the portion of the charge that sort of states the intent, which is to reduce regulatory confusion, improve clarity, and facilitate implementation of standards by counties. Those are particularly the things that I'd ask folks to keep in mind as we're having discussion today. All right. So we are going to start today with the conversation on non-farm uses and what we call multi-path permitting options. And these are themes that emerged as really a high priority for most members of the 2023 Technical Working Group in some aspect or another. And at Commission, we've heard from a number of stakeholders that there is a general concern over the lack of clarity here and the very fine lines between, a variety of possible permitting pathways for certain types of proposals. And I know that there are a lot of opinions and concerns on this topic, and we want to make sure that there's space to hear from everyone. So please do raise your hand before you share, and we will call on folks. And I'm going to ask Casaria to please help me to make sure that we don't miss anybody who has a raised hand. And if you're having difficulty with the raised hand function or unmuting, please go ahead and drop a note into the chat, and I'm going to ask Casaria to keep an eye on that for us. All right. So before we start in, I want to clarify a few things. About what you've seen in the materials package particularly. So for home occupations, the department recognizes that very early on, the legislature determined to provide an opportunity for folks to run a small business out of their home or garage, whether it was associated with a farm operation or not. Home occupations are also allowed in most residential zones, small-scale businesses, again, operated out of houses or garage. And it's really common to see all sorts of things like dog grooming or nail salons as home businesses. And so I want to be clear that the department supports this sort of opportunity for rural residents to run a side business or a primary business, maybe even out of their home. And again, that we recognize that it is often not and doesn't have to be related to a farm use. For commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, the department believes it's very clear that there is an intent that large-scale farm-related processing be reviewable as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. And we support that as a pathway for things like farm-related commercial activities like meat processing, seed cleaning, co-packing plants, fertilizer plants. A lot of what we have heard about concerns around scale and intensity. But the language that we're starting with here today, the language we've presented to start off this discussion, is based around a general planning principle that essentially says, if something is described in regulation, that is what it is. It can't alternatively be reviewed as something else unless it is explicitly allowed to be reviewed as something else, like wineries, for example. They are explicitly authorized in statute to be reviewed as commercial activities in conjunction with farm use in the alternative to being reviewed under 215-452 or 215-453. So there's this general planning principle out there. But when you get to the farm zone, it becomes confusing because there are these catch-all categories like home occupations and commercial activities in conjunction with farm use. So let me explain that a little bit more. I'm going to use cider tasting as an example. So if somebody comes into a planning counter and wants to offer cider tastings, the planner needs to make some space because there are a number of different ways that you could permit cider tasting. Starting with sub 1 uses, you could permit cider tasting at a farm stand. Right, so that's sub 1 use, which allows fee-based activities to promote the sale of, for example, apples sold at the farm stand or cider sold at the farm stand. And that's subject to a revenue limitation. So there comes up a question, when should that fee-based cider tasting at the farm stand be permitted instead as an agritourism event or agritourism and other commercial events? So there's 4 different opportunities for that are set forth and described in statute, which we talked about a couple months ago. When should that cider tasting really be reviewed under a cider business in 215-451? When should that cider tasting, be appropriately reviewed as a home occupation, where somebody is going to be offering that cider tasting, out of their garage? When does it instead rise to the level of being permitted as a, sort of event-oriented commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, or should it be? So there are a number of different ways in which cider tastings might be permitted, and all of them have their own set of standards. And those standards and opportunities to some degree or other may vary from county to county. And this creates some confusion, particularly for statewide organizations who are looking to support agritourism in general. In Oregon, because there are just so many different ways and so many different standards associated with those variety of ways, depending on the proposal. Another interesting example here is childcare. There are very specific statutory standards in Chapter 215 for childcare facilities in farm zones. And as I noted in the materials packet, we've seen childcare facilities reviewed as home occupations instead of reviewed subject to those standards and statute. So can you do that? It's back to that general planning principle. If it's listed, as explicitly subject to standards, should you be able to review it as something else? So that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about multi-path permitting, which has been a subject of discussion over a couple of years now. So we've had requests for guidance documents on these topics. We've heard suggestions that certain types of uses be prohibited from consideration as home occupations or commercial activities in conjunction with farm use. We have had requests to clarify the intensity and scope of permissible home occupations, to clarify the intensity and scope of commercial activities in conjunction with farm use and farm stands, and establish when they're no longer appropriate for a rural environment. And so today we're starting with sort of like this general conversation revolving around this more basic planning principle, which, if it's already listed, that's what it is. All right. So I'm going to ask actually the planners to start this discussion, maybe by talking a little bit about how they work with these types of questions when they have applicants at the counter, and maybe share some examples on how easy or difficult there is. Is there a need for clarity and guidance here? What do you experience in trying to lead people through the variety of options? How do you work with that general planning principle when you're looking at home occupations or commercial activities in conjunction with farm use or other proposals? So any volunteers to get the conversation started there from planning staff?
Yeah, I can lead off.
Thanks, Austin.
Yeah, no problem. So for the way I like to do things, is I kind of like to, when people come in with questions like this, to sort of ask, what is your full build out? What is your dream? What do you want to happen in the end? Kind of start there a little bit so you can see, like, if you do want to do your full build out, what are all the regulations that are going to come into play? And then from there, I like to kind of work backwards and say, do you have a timeline? Are you trying to implement half of this in 2 years or 5 years, or is this a 10-year plan for you? Because, like you said with the cidery example right there, the cider tasting, maybe someone wants to get to a full cidery, but they're not going to establish that right now. They need to get, trees in the ground and a production facility and all those things. So maybe they're going to start with the farm stand and start tasting. So we can say, hey, you're right here right now. You're at a farm stand level. You're not at a cidery level yet. Let's get you the farm stand permit so you can start operating and kind of get into the world, and then come back when you're ready to establish that cidery. So we normally break it down into steps like that, based on time, based on what your whole implementation idea is going to be, and then try to work with them to get them the best permit that we can approve at that time. There are other situations though where people, maybe they're more confident about their operation, they want to go for the big permit at first, and we'll do that, but we'll let them know that, like for a winery, right? You've got to establish your grapes. You've got to establish the processing facility. So you're not going to be able to get there in like 1 year immediately. So we really try to let them know that information up front, but kind of work through their whole business plan. And oftentimes we tell people, we tell people, what you have is great right now, but go back and with maybe your other business partners, work on a really specific business plan, and then bring that back to us so we can really get you a specific code criteria to meet. So sometimes we turn it back on them so they can get a more specific business plan. That's the kind of way we do things, to kind of see where you're at now, what permit's appropriate, and does it need a larger permit in the future. That's generally the way we do things. And it hasn't Hasn't been too bad for us. Last year we had a lavender farm come in for a farm stand, and then that turned into something larger than a farm stand. So this year they're coming in for agritourism permits so they can do the stuff that they were kind of doing last year. So that's like a good example of how we step people up to the right permit.
And how do you, what sort of advice do you give them on like when they need that next permit or when they're going to need that next permit level?
So I normally tell people apply earlier rather than later, because with review times and appeals, you never know what might happen. So I tend to tell people, you know, because like at least in Marion County, our agritourism permits aren't too expensive. I think I forget the exact amount, but you're probably not going to pay more than like $1,500 for 18 permits in a year, agritourism events. So I kind of tell people, if $1,500 is not detrimental to your operation and you think you're going to host some number of agritourism permits, let's get you approved now so that when the summer comes, you can do your events and not be in, you know, code enforcement issues and things like that. So I kind of err on the side of do things earlier. If you have the money and you think you're going to do the events, do them earlier. Let's get you approved. If you don't do all the events, that's okay. But if you do half of them, then you're golden.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles?
Yeah, thank you. Austin, that was awesome. And that's pretty much, I think, the way we do it too. I also like to look at it, try to explain to them that, you know, a farm use is a type 1 use. So you have to look at your product, you know, your business plan at a scale of what scale and where you are on that scale. If you're at one extreme end of farming, you know, that's a type 1. But as you move up towards a commercial side of it, you're going to need a level 2 or level type 3 application, depending on the events and activities that you're proposing. So I agree a lot with what Austin said. I did want to kind of change it a little. I think it was Mr. McCarthy was talking about had the images of the home occupations and turning into short-term rentals and so forth. We wouldn't allow those things because the owner has to be in a home occupation. They have to reside on the owner or occupant has to reside on the property during the operation of that home occupation. So we don't allow short-term rentals without that first occupant on the residence. So I know I switched the subject a little bit, but I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
No, thank you, Charles. And yeah, that is I feel like a slightly separate topic that maybe we won't get into today, but short-term rentals are the most commonly approved home occupation use that we see in farm zones. Megan?
Umatilla County takes the same approach as Marion County. The one thing that's kind of unique is a few years ago, the county implemented a maximum parking standard for home occupations, and that's 10 parking spaces. And so that kind of, you know, restricts the intensity of a home occupation.
That's a very good point, Megan. So a lot of counties, some counties do have additional standards for home occupation that limit the scope and scale of a home occupation, whether it's the number of parking spaces or the number of visitors per day, outside signage, square footage. We've seen a number of things like that that are voluntary for counties to adopt to limit the sort of scope and scale of home occupations. But that's not a requirement at the state level. And there are also counties that don't have those types of standards that would limit the sort of extent of what's permissible. Maitri and then Amber.
Yeah, so in my experience, so one of the benefits that I see of the multi-permitting pathway is that farm operations of all scales and intensity are able to operate things like distilleries or a processing facility at an intensity that works for their farm operation. So the primary concern I would have in removing these options is it might close the door on the smaller businesses who maybe say grow some crops in their backyard, then process and prefer to sell on a really small scale from their home, or maybe don't have the means to support an operation that is larger than a smaller processing facility. And we haven't run into too many issues with the multi-path permitting. I think it has to do with the fact that agritourism as such isn't permitted at Washington County, so that kind of takes a layer away. So that essentially leaves home occupations that are very, very restrictive at Washington County. We never allow the use of outdoor spaces, and the number of employees and customers is more restrictive than what the state allows. So we do see all kinds of requests, waiting venues, processing facilities, childcare, everything, but it's restricted, pretty restricted. So that's worked out fine. And also with a home occupation, the other thing to consider is the processing is a much simpler process than the kind of review and the standards that would apply if this were to go through a full-blown winery or a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. So retaining that kind of helps the more mom and pop type of operations. And regarding the commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, standalone events are not permitted in conjunction with farming alone. They're only allowed as 25% incidental, say with farm stands or a smaller winery. That's not really that doesn't really meet the definition of a winery. So, so that's kind of my thoughts on the multi-permitting pathway. But in helping helping an applicant determine what process to follow, it's kind of similar to what was discussed earlier. We usually ask the applicant what they have in mind, and that kind of helps flush out and gets them thinking on what can or cannot be allowed. Because sometimes they just come in and say, hey, we want a farm stand. But then, we start asking all the questions, and that kind of gets them thinking on what they want to really do. And then we're able to kind of walk them through what they actually should be doing for that.
And so there's a sort of like a business walkthrough where you're sort of reviewing. One of the questions I think that came up a number of times during the technical review committee is how do you determine when the events at the farm stand need, that some other type of permit, or like how do you counsel somebody up front on those questions?
Well, at this point, the only thing we've been doing is the 25% really incidental income, and it's fairly open to the type of events that they can host. And that's one of the things we discussed at one of the other racks, that maybe one of the ways to handle that is to have them provide something by a CPA based on the type of operation. So that's probably something to take into consideration. But that's pretty much it, really. There's no way to monitor it at this point. So if there's maybe some kind of a guidance on what kind of scale should be allowed, what kind of events, what kind of scale, that would be great. Otherwise, the CPA might be an option to consider here.
Okay, thank you. And then Amber?
Thanks, Hillary. So I don't have much to add, except that when I was preparing for the meeting and looking over the applications we've approved, which wasn't an exhaustive review, but in looking at those, I didn't see a lot of overlap between the commercial activities in conjunction with farm use and home occupations and the other uses that are explicitly called out. And I think that's a lot to do with the planner and duty conversations that are had. I think by and large, we talk about their business plans and walk through the options, and we haven't seen, not 100% of the time, but by and large haven't seen proposals that exceed those standards through the home occupation and commercial activity in conjunction with farm use.
And so generally, you're having those conversations up front and are able to channel folks appropriately.
Yes. And it we just haven't really seen it as much of an issue.
All right, thank you, Amber. All right, Samantha, and then maybe from some folks who had some questions or concerns about the lack of clarity here. Samantha?
Yeah, I would also be interested to hear who thinks there is a lack of clarity here and a little bit more why, because I haven't heard that yet. And in my experience, I'm not sure that the law is unclear. We have a multi-permitting pathway, and There's actually quite a bit of legislative history for some of these things that it's not supposed to be preclusive. There's supposed to be multiple options. And generally, I have found that planners, to what folks have said earlier, like being able to work with people through either pre-application meetings and saying, here's your suite of options. It gives them more flexibility. It's more of a collaborative process and not a adversarial process. And I'm just not sure why we would want to preclude people from having multiple options to apply for things if they could qualify. You're not throwing, the rule book out. They would still have to qualify under a certain option, and those are statutorily allowed. So I'm having a hard time understanding why we would do this, and it's kind of coming across that we're just trying to limit options for farmers in the farm zone. On the proposed idea on that one. The other thing I wanted to flag is on home occupations. There is quite a bit of case law that's been established out there. And even, LUBA, we dealt with home occupations 3 weeks ago. That makes pretty clear that the size and scope of home occupations have already been limited by the standards put in place in statute. And it's a lot of the things that I'm seeing folks be concerned about in comments. The Court of Appeals and LUBA has already made clear that those things were intended to be allowed in the farm zone. They're just supposed to be limited by what's already in place in statute. So I'm not, again, this kind of feels like it's counter to what existing case law says, which is a little bit confusing because I think the charter has been about codifying case law. So I have concerns about that, and I'm having a hard time understanding the policy reasons for wanting to do this because it doesn't seem like there's a lack of clarity here.
And so your support for flexibility, the sort of ability to work with a planner like on business evolution over time, and the flexibility to go through sort of a phased expansion approach, understanding that additional permits may be required over time. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate, if we're going to be in previous RAC meetings really talking about case law, then I think we should be, and we're going to take up home occupations, then we should be considering all of the most recent case law on home occupations.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll go Rob, Rory, and then Olivier.
Hi. I wasn't on the technical working group, so I don't know exactly what the conversation was that led to this rising up to be an issue, but I accept that it is, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So it was with that in mind that our comments from Friends of Yamhill County are based on with the assumption that this is a legitimate issue, and then trying to make the rule language work. And our concern is that it doesn't. I appreciate Hillary's preamble saying that we're working on this basic planning principle of the if it's listed one place, then that's the only thing, it's the only place it's allowed. And I think in some cases that is true. I think there are some statutory uses where the legislature intended on that listed use as being the universe of allowable activities under that genre of activity. But then in other cases, that's not necessarily the case. And so we're concerned that the proposed language is both too broad and too narrow at the same time, that it's allowing things maybe that, well, it isn't necessarily allowing things, it's leaving the question open as to what is allowed, which is just going to lead to more litigation and arguments at the local level. And alternatively, it may be prohibiting some things that shouldn't be prohibited. And so it's with that in mind that we tried to come up with some language that we thought would better address that issue. A more targeted approach to figuring out what are those uses that the statute limits and what are those uses that that are more appropriate under the broad home occupation or commercial activity umbrella. And so it's with that in mind that we submitted our comments. I'm fully aware that that short-term rentals are not an issue under the multi-path question, that the home occupation really seems to be the only route for that. I guess the only other route is like Washington County, that they're not allowed, or no, I guess it was Jackson County we heard that from. But we wanted to include that because we figured, you know, this issue is open. The rule on home occupations is open. And if we want to raise this issue at LCDC later, we don't want to sandbag. We want it out there that this is an issue that we think should be addressed. And we wanted to provide some examples of why we think it's a problem, which those visuals that we submitted do hopefully show that there's an issue, at least in Yamhill County. I would point out that both of those on the first page of our illustrations, the two of the bed and breakfast hotels, there are operators residing on site there. They just to mention what Charles had said, that these aren't just straight Airbnbs. The third one, the big mansion, there's no on-site operator there, but the first two they do meet the requirement for an on-site operator. Although it was only after our objection in one of them after that the applicant moved the operator into the dwelling. But anyway, so it was with that in mind that we submitted our comments. I think I've covered some of what we talked about already, but I did want to mention that we think that particularly retail sales are not appropriate in a home occupation. We thought that the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages are things that the legislature has already dealt with, as are events, and other high traffic operations are not suitable or are not appropriate as a home occupation, and not what the legislature had envisioned when it added that as a use. Hillary already mentioned that about processing. That was one of the uses in the commercial activity in conjunction with farm use that we were afraid was going to get swept up in an appropriate commercial activity in conjunction with farm use that we were afraid was going to get prohibited when that is a legitimate, secondary farming activity. So I think I've probably talked long enough.
Thank you, Rob. And
Unless you have any questions?
You want to just summarize your sort of language proposal there again? Was to exclude certain types of uses from consideration.
Right. Instead of just the general language, the theoretical language, if it's listed one place, then it's not listed, then you can't do it here. We instead targeted those uses that we believed were not intended to be a home occupation or a commercial activity by the legislature and by subsequent case law, and list those as basically exclusions. We proposed a definition of home occupation. We did not propose a definition of commercial activity. That's sort of been done by the courts and taken up in the earlier meetings of this group. It isn't proposed as a definition, but it functions as one. And so we were just proposing to add to what is included, add what is not included.
All right, thank you very much. So we'll hear from Rory, and then Olivier, then Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a question about sort of examples of where we've seen lack of clarity around these issues, and a couple immediately came to mind for me just in the last few years here in Deschutes County, where I do a lot of work. I've been involved on a couple applications where an applicant comes in asking for essentially events, but under a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use application. And everyone involved is sort of like thrown up their hands. So including planners at the county and members of the public, like, well, wait a second, we have this agritourism statute. Shouldn't that be how this application is processed? And it's led to sort of a messy public process, I'd say, where at least in one of those instances, there was a dispute at the local level, and folks ended up talking off the record and settling, which was good in the short term, because it came to an agreement that met everyone's concerns. But bigger picture, I think that's not great planning process. To your initial point, Hillary, about when you have a listed use, that's the standards and criteria we should go by, because it makes things a little opaque for the public and anyone else following along about, oh, well, how did that applicant get their event center through commercial activity in conjunction with farm use permit? So I do think there's a lack of clarity and confusion in how some of these proposals are processed, and definitely support trying to fix that.
All right, thank you, Rory. So we'll hear from Olivier, and then Catherine, and then Ken.
Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, I want to echo some of the comments that Sam provided. I think we've heard from some of the counties earlier that, to the contrary, that doesn't seem to be some confusion here, but rather flexibility for applicants and counties to work together on permitting some of those activities. And frankly, it allows, some smaller applicants to kind of slowly scale up and have, permitting pathways to build up their activities, rather than only allowing someone that has a means to be fully built out right away to get permitted. So I think, the proposal right now would pretty significantly roll back rights for property owners on farmland. So we see that as problematic without really a good reason to do so. I think, you mentioned that some statewide organization were asking for clarity to advise their members. We are a statewide organization with members all over the state, and we have been perfectly fine with the current landscape, and quite to the contrary, it's appreciated because it offers winemakers some additional permitting path, and they're able to work with county planners to build out their activities. The fact that there is one big mention in Yamhill County that is permitted as such, to me, doesn't really convey that there's a huge statewide problem that needs to be addressed. And so I'm really struggling to see what we're trying to accomplish with the proposed changes, and what problem we're trying to solve. And again, I mean, like others, I was not in the technical working group. I don't know that many of those interests were represented in those technical working group, because it's really inconsistent with what us as a statewide organization we're seeing with our members. So that would be our main concerns here.
And so again, you're hearing a question on this sort of statement of need for this particular approach.
Yeah, and just the danger of rolling back rights when I don't really see the problem. And there might be different interpretation in counties around the state, and that's fine. Those are discretionary uses, and so county can adopt different standards. And one county might not permit home occupation exactly the same way as another county, and that's perfectly fine. County can have slightly different interpretation on discretionary uses because they have different policy priorities, and they have different people in charge and different economies. And so that's the point of those more discretionary permits and the different pathways that are available. And so I see the proposed changes as really inconsistent with that ability to offer flexibility for farmers to permit the activities.
Okay, thank you, Olivier.
Thank you.
So we'll have Catherine, and then Ken, and then Megan. So Catherine?
I want to, yes, I'd like to add my support for Rob's suggestion for a definition for home occupation. I think that's a great idea. There currently is no definition for home occupation statewide. There are a few standards for home occupations, but no actual definition, something that tells us what a home occupation is. I think this provides what he's given us here in the materials that were sent out provides added clarity for both applicants and counties, and definitely, I think, reduces regulatory confusion. Rob mentioned the types of uses that his definition would not include as part of home occupations, but he didn't convey the first sentence. And since some people didn't get the materials, I want to just read the sentence. He says, a home occupation is a business engaged in the manufacture of a product or the provision of a service carried on in compliance with OAR 660, 033, 0130, 14 by a resident of the property on which the business is located. What I think is still missing is a relational connection between the home occupation and the residential use of the property. It seems to me that we're wanting to see not a standalone use, not a primary use, but a home occupation that's an accessory, incidental, and secondary use to the primary residential use of the property. And that would go for both the conditional uses that are already allowed in statute, as well as a host of other uses that are not specifically allowed in the EFU zone that are in fact being approved right now. So the technical group came up with suggestions for a number of specific sideboards. I know that would go beyond the scope of what we're here to do today, but a definition that at least spoke to the relational aspect of the home occupation use and the primary residential use would be really useful, I think, in narrowing the scale and intensity and types of uses to those that are appropriate in a farm zone and not those that are inappropriate and not actually allowed at all in the farm zone on their own otherwise. As for the are we going to talk about the commercial activities later, or is this just home
Go
occupation?
ahead. You bring it up as well.
Commercial activities. I think that what's proposed by staff is a little problematic in that larger scale processing facilities need to be able to use the commercial activities in conjunction with farm use path to be allowed. So that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Catherine. And so what I'm hearing is support for Rob's definition of a home occupation and maybe the addition of some language that a home occupation business is incidental and subordinate to a primary residential use to avoid a situation where we have home occupations that are more like a commercial use with a, caretaker residence or something like that on the property. Okay, thank you. So we'll have Ken and then Megan and then Mike. So Ken, go ahead. The mic is yours.
I'll try to keep this pretty quick. I want to really echo what Olivier said as well as Sam. I'm a little bit confused by the process at this point because we've had a couple of other RAC meetings where staff was very strong that we're dealing with case law issues and we are not making public policy. And yet some of the things we're talking about here, like defining home occupation and whatnot, those are policy conversations that need to be had by the legislature and not by this group and not by just the agency. So I kind of feel like we're getting two different sets of instructions depending on what the issue is that this RAC is dealing with. And in this one in particular, it's very much a policy discussion. We're not addressing particular issues with case law. You're hearing a whole bunch of different stuff, and it all is seemingly at restriction. And that is, I don't think that the direction that we're supposed to take here. I thought we were supposed to be clarifying case law, et cetera, and not having broader policy discussions. So I just want to say this one feels a little bit weird to me because we're looking at significant policy changes. And my understanding is the charge of this body is not to do that. So that's all I'm going to say at this point.
All right, thank you, Ken. So when Commission expanded the charge in April, they added a number of issues that went beyond the codification of case law that we were talking about with our original charge. And
but we're not talking about codifying case law.
Yeah.
here.
So the direction on this one was really around that sort of planning principle idea of if something is articulated in regulation, may it alternatively be reviewed to something else or not. And I just wanted to acknowledge when we opened this conversation that there were a number of proposals that have been offered over the past year at different approaches to this. So I expected that this would be a broader conversation around sort of limiting these uses. But the focus of this charge really is on that planning principle. If it's something that's already listed in Chapter 215 with specific standards. So for example, I'll use the daycare example. There's a very specific standards for daycares in Chapter 215. And we also see daycares permitted as home occupations without application of those standards in 215, 283, 215, 213. And so the conversation's really around that question. So I want to be clear on that. And I know that we're going to get a lot of feedback on ideas for limiting home occupations because that was a primary concern that we've heard over the past year.
That's the
All
concern
right.
you've heard from certain groups of
From
folks
certain
and
groups of
not
folks.
applicants. And what it seems like is that torch
Yeah.
is the one that's being carried forward and not a broader policy discussion that might be appropriate from the legislature, which is what the message from this rack has been the entire time. So I got to push back on that, Hillary.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. So we'll hear from Megan and then Mike and then Samantha and then Blair.
Yeah, Hillary, my concern with this language is that it really opens up the possibilities for uses that can happen on EFU and farm and forest lands. I've mentioned this example before, but I'm going to bring it back. So last year, we had an applicant propose a construction business as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. And there wasn't really a farm use, but they were saying they serve businesses that are farmers. And so that was the correlation there. And our staff issued a recommendation of denial to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission ultimately approved it. And so I just see more things like that if this language is brought forward. There is that significant impacts test, but unless you have really strong opponents, it's not going to really matter. And then as far as the processing and the fruit packing examples, in my experience, I like the flexibility of being able to permit those as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use, and they are less impactful than those other uses like construction businesses. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. So you're experiencing that there's sort of like a lack of clarity in this definitional category that's, in your opinion, led to some maybe questionable approvals. Yeah. Okay. Mike and then Samantha and then Blair.
Yeah, I farm and I start in a little different place. I still believe that the farm zone should be for farming and food production. And that's kind of where I come down on this. And in Hood River County in particular, although in a number of other counties, we're getting so far away from food production in the farm zone that it really doesn't comply with state law. And that's why, in my opinion, we need more clarity and simplicity. And we need the uses to be either listed as allowed uses or not allowed. And I think they need to be called out individually and listed as allowed or not allowed. And the wording in commercial activities in conjunction with farm zone is very unclear what's allowed there. We have a case in Hood River County where we had one applicant that our land use group worked for 4 years with the county to try to zero in on what was really allowed there and what wasn't. And initially, they weren't doing anything that had any way related to the farm. It was a beer and pizza restaurant in the farm zone. They somehow thought it was allowed. But so we have these examples going on. We spent hundreds of hours on that trying to fix that one because the wording was not clear in the law. And I think it's just critical that we fix some of these things. The amount of time that's wasted by citizens and the planning staff and even the applicants is just unnecessary. And I think it makes people disappointed in the planning process. And one of the things we see in Hood River County is many of them do not meet the 25% test. Many of them violate the parking requirement. Many people trespass on neighboring lands and slow down farm work. There's excessive traffic. And so these are the things that we see that occur. And we need the law to be clear as to its intent. And for an example, in the home occ one, I think what we've seen is that buildings normally associated with uses permitted in the zone, people come in and build all kinds of buildings, call them farm buildings, and then they use them for some kind of home occ or later tourism activity and call them buildings normally associated, and they weren't built. They were built as a farm building at some point the year before they made application. The other thing that concerns me is home occupations should not be operated by an employee. They should be operated by the resident. And there are situations where employees, the resident's not there. It may be their principal resident, but they're not there for 5 months of the year and somebody else is running the business. They're not responsible, and there's other things that happen on other people's properties. So I support the definition of home occ, some kind of clear definition that was brought up. I think that's very important. And it only lends to clarity and simplicity and people applying and getting what they want. So I mean, I could go on forever about this in Hood River County on the number of things that really are messed up about the way this whole system works. It's time we fixed it.
All right, thank you, Mike. So another concern about sort of the lack of clarity of what a home occupation is or what a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use is. And again, we're hearing potentially uses maybe that aren't necessarily alternatively authorized in Chapter 215, like the construction business or the restaurant, but uses that are not allowed in 215 that seek approval as commercial uses under these broader statutes, or sorry, broader definition categories. All right, so we'll hear from Samantha and then Blair.
I mean, I'm really going to reiterate what Ken said, but I think at this point, what's really frustrating is that I keep hearing the word clarity thrown out, and it's clear these things are allowed in the farm zone. The legislature decided that, and it's not for DLC. It's not within DLCD's authority to go back and say, okay, yeah, these things should be allowed and these things are not, because the legislature already decided that. And if folks don't like that and they don't like what the legislature decided, or they don't like what the courts have interpreted that to be, they should go back to the legislature and change that. And so it's really frustrating to feel like this RAC, which most of us were not allowed to be a part of at the beginning through the technical work group, is being used to change things and make pretty significant policy decisions that are counter to what the legislature has decided or case law. And I just would reiterate, this whole process feels like a huge bait and switch. When we started with, we're going to codify case law, to now we're going to ignore case law and have this push to do things that is the opposite of what case law says. And I also just want to flag, it is also frustrating to hear folks say, well, we've got to fix this because there's so much litigation being filed. Well, why is the litigation being filed and who's filing it? I mean, it's kind of ironic at this point. It sounds like a lot of the groups who are the ones filing the litigation are now concerned about the amount of litigation. So it seems clear. I'm not sure what is technical and what is clarity at this point. And I think what would be helpful moving forward from trying to move this RAC into any sort of a positive direction or from a relationship standpoint is at the beginning of the next RAC meeting. If we could have a clear set of guidelines, and I don't know, I think Commissioner Boyer is still listening, but I think what would be really helpful is to have a clear understanding of what the purpose of this rack is and what it's not, because we flip-flop back and forth significantly.
All right, thank you. So I do want to clarify that we don't have the authority to change statutory provisions. And so that is not something that we're considering here, changes to statutory provisions as a RAC. That is not our focus or intent here. All right, so we will hear from Blair, and then is it Jim and then Mike?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I thought that LCDC's charge was really clear. The first part was about codifying case law, and then in April they went back and there was a lot of discussion, and they listed 5 specific areas where we would work on, and they said no to a lot of requests to work on other issues. And so we're doing exactly what that charge says. It's not beyond the charge. It's not confusing. It's written in the materials. It's on the website. You can listen to LCDC talk about it the last time. So I'm confused why that's confusing, because it seems pretty clear to me. I also think it's extremely narrow charge. It is not broad, but it does include policy discussion. Because if you're saying there's only one way to get a certain kind of permit, that is a policy. LCDC has extraordinarily broad policy-making authority under ORS Chapter 197. So all of you who haven't read lately Lane County versus LCDC 1997 Supreme Court case out of Oregon Supreme Court, it talks about that authority. So LCDC isn't confined to 215. They just haven't done anything in 30 years. So everybody forgets, and everyone's kind of shocked that LCDC would possibly consider adding protections for farmland. Oh my God, without legislative direction. They have legislative direction. It was created in Senate Bill 100, which told them to go forth and protect agricultural land. So they're returning to that direction, and they're doing that now, but on a teeny weeny skinny scale. I mean, saying that you have to follow a certain path in permitting is not a radical alteration of the uses allowed in the farm zone. So I think the reaction is really kind of extreme to what we think is extremely narrow. So that said, I agree very strongly. We agree very strongly with what Catherine Daniel said. What would be more effective than this single path permitting thing, which still is, it's just, it doesn't address the bigger problem, is saying what a home occupation is, and that it's a secondary use to the primary home occupation. That was brilliant. So we fully endorse Catherine's suggestion on that definition. Thanks.
Thank you, Blair. And I just want to clarify that any rule language that we do propose, we do have the support of the Department of Justice, who will, make sure that that is within our rulemaking authority. So we have Jim, and then Mike, and then Olivia.
Yeah, thanks. Blair kind of hit what I was going to talk on, but so I'm just going to give a couple of examples. LCDC has broad authority to do policy work and protection of farmland, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. The restrictions placed on high-value farmland originally came out of administrative rule. Golf courses are listed in the statute, for example, as a use that may be permitted as a sub-2 use by the statute. LCDC took it further and said golf courses are not allowed on high-value farmland. And there's several other uses like that LCDC used their authority to limit their ability to be located within the exclusive farm use zone. The farm dwellings test, the 80,000 standard, the different standards and the like, that is not from statute. That was adopted by LCDC, consistent with the case law that Blair just mentioned. So I just wanted to make it clear, LCDC has broad authority to protect farmland, and in many cases to be more restrictive in terms of what uses may be allowed, especially for those sub-2 uses. So, and then in terms of definitions, a lot of the definitions that we operate with today are LCDC definitions. They are not statutory definitions. The legislature is actually done a pretty poor job historically of defining terms. They just list things and then don't define them. So they've left that up to LCDC to better define what those terms are that are referenced in statute. So that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Did you want to say something about the topic that we're considering today, which is sort of that general planning principle that is some things like listed?
Well, yeah, I mean, those of us that have been land use planners at the counter, and I was a county planner years ago and the like, have kind of operated under the idea, and this is something that they teach in planning school, that it's a general planning purpose. And I remember my legal counsel when I was a county planner saying, hey, the use is listed over here, specifically defined. You can't call it something else. So that is not a new standard. That is not something that's not understood by planners as a general planning purpose. And so I would support that if a use is specifically listed and less specifically called out, having another options like what wineries say. Wineries specifically say wineries go through this process and they can also go through commercial use in conjunction with farm use. I would support that if it's specifically listed and not otherwise authorized, you can't use a multiple path. In fact, I would suggest to you that the fact that the legislature specifically called out that wineries can do this, but they didn't give that authority to other land uses, that there's some legislative intent that that's what the legislature wants to happen. I'm just suggesting that to you. I'd leave that up to the lawyers to find out. So.
All right, thank you. So we have Mike and then Olivier.
Yeah, I don't want to duplicate too much what was said, but in a general sense, I believe the whole land use goal 3 system is to protect farmland for farm use, and I don't think that's any kind of a stretch on what the legal requirement is. And so I think we're well within our legal authority to do what's needed. And I think on commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, we know that there was a bunch of case law that we worked with, and the case law came about because the commercial activity in conjunction with farm use route was so unclear that there was a lot of case law on it. And this attempt here, for my thinking, is only to make it coincide with the case law and make it more clear. And an example of how unclear many of these rules are, our land use group in Hood River County has taken, I believe, 10 cases now to LUBA because we in the county disagreed on whether what the rule actually said. And to me, that's an example of the lack of clarity. And we don't just take these cases just for the fun of it. We won 9 out of 10 cases at LUBA. And the whole basis of all of that was that the rules are unclear. And that's the fundamental problem. The rules are unclear. It's interpreted one way or another, and they don't really agree in the end with the intent. And then you have to take it to LUBA or the Court of Appeals.
All right, thank you, Mike. And so I'm hearing, from folks that it is nice to have this flexibility that is helpful, particularly for farmers who are sort of growing a business to start off at, a sub 1 level and plan to grow into sub 2 type businesses, and that there is maybe a nice progression of evolution of a business, and also that there's some lack of clarity on where the boundaries are on what is appropriately permitted under particularly under the home occupation or commercial activity category. The charges focused on, uses that are already listed in 215 subject to standards versus the sort of like catch-all categories with home occupations and CACFUs, where we see a lot of different things happening. And as Jim just explained to us, one of the principles, is if it's, explicitly listed, like the wineries, there's a section of statute that says explicitly that wineries may be reviewed as commercial activities in the alternative to 215-452, 215-453. I'm wondering also about the idea of maybe rule language that specifies how which things may alternatively be reviewed instead of limiting by explicitly stating what may. Just a food for thought out there. Olivier, and let's see, I think Olivia is the only person that has their hand up right now. So the mic is yours.
I'll try to be brief. Thanks, Hillary. I think, and maybe I'll echo what's been said before, but I guess what I'm hearing is that there's one set of commenters on this that are saying some people are breaking the rules. There are rules around home occupation and commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. Some people are breaking the rules, so let's get rid of the whole thing. And our opinion is that as a policy principle, this is just not a good policy principle. We have enforcement available when there's an issue going on, and counties do enforce violations of their code. And so I think, using an example here and there to say people are using that as a justification to say let's just get rid of the whole thing, I just don't see that as a good policy moving forward. So I guess that's really what it comes down to. The crux of it, from what I'm hearing, is some people having issue with a use here and they're pushing the envelope and wanted to get rid of the whole thing. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. All right, Mickey.
Okay, I've listened and I've listened. And these are my questions. First of all, to Olivier for his last comment. Then I feel from your comment, then you would support better enforcement. But my main premise to state is you're in a farm zone or a forest zone. And I want to know what protection I have. And don't anybody tell me right to farm. Right to farm does not protect me except for in very restricted circumstances, and it's only when I'm doing a farming practice. So if I have a dairy care sited next to me and I want to spray, has anybody looked at what impact that'll have on me? So there needs to be better impact tests, and there needs to be impact tests on everything, in my opinion, whether it's in the farm zone or forest zone. And that's the question as a farmer. What are the impacts going to be to me? Like some of the county planners said they have parking limitations, and that's really helped. Well, every time you have to put a limitation in to help, that tells me there's problems from what I've heard today from different people. I'm a property owner. I'm a property owner in a farm zone. My farm zone supposedly was protected under Goal 3, and it keeps getting fractured more and more. And I think everybody needs to go back and listen to what the director of DLCD said at the legislative days before the House Ag Committee. She went out and visited with every county planning office and came back and engaged with her staff to start these processes so that the county planners' input to them triggered this, went to technical group from my understanding, and then we're here as RAC. So I think everybody needs to realize what we're here for. We're here to listen to the planners, and we're also here to listen to the farmers on the impacts to them. And the rest of the group that talk about, I'm an attorney and I represent this group and we do this suit and this suit and this law and this law and that law. But let's go back to the basics, everybody, and stay on task and look at what is important to everybody. It is important to me. I have learned so much from listening to the planners. I also have learned there's a lack of enforcement. I have also learned that I am not protected under right to farm. from anything that anybody in agritourism does, anybody in a home occupation does, and when they impact me. So those are my comments for today. And I just hope everybody listens and thinks about it. And it was interesting to hear Blair Batson talk about Senate Bill 100, the Supreme Court case, and case law. So if that is underlining case law, then that is the case law underlining LCDC's authority. So that was interesting to learn today. And I'm not an attorney, and I don't speak attorney. I'm a simple shepherd, and I'm just speaking in shepherd terms. So I'm done speaking, and Hillary and Gordon are doing fine. And Gordon hasn't been sent to slaughter yet.
I appreciate the goat update. I'm glad Gordon hasn't been sent to slaughter yet. I'm sure he is as well. Thank you. Mickey, brought up something that's vaguely related to this, but I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding about right to farm, and so I just want to take an opportunity to talk about that for a quick second. So Oregon's right to farm laws protect a farmer from suit based on practices that they're engaging in. Right to farm laws do not protect a farmer from impacts from outside. So it only works for inside the farm. So I think that needs to be more broadly understood. All right, Charles.
Yes, thanks. I was just going to add to the comments. So the Jackson County does have additional standards we actually have something called home occupations, which are a smaller scale version of what we also have, a larger scale, which is a home business. So there's two types of standards for those and criteria. We do require the farm impacts test as part of that review. Mm-hmm. I think the point I'd like to make is that so a home occupation, home businesses are accessories to the residents. They're not accessory to the farm process, their farm uses. They're different categories. So I think that's the distinction that I'd like to make, is that you can do different things as an accessory to the residents. So that's when you would elevate or evolve. If you're going to then become, you can have your farming activity and you can have your residential activity, and then that farming activity may elevate to a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. And so there's the tiers and distinction. The home occupation, home business is limited in scale and scope and has standards to restrict you because you're accessory to the residents. So that's, I think, when we, and I would say that, yes, there is a lack of clarity, but that gives the flexibility and the discretion to the counties to work with that flexibility. So when you add clarity, then you're taking away that flexibility. So I just wanted to make those points.
Hey, thank you, Charles. How do you distinguish between a home occupation and a home business, just out of curiosity?
Well, usually home occupations, it's in all zones, you're limited to the number of employees, the number of parking spaces. Mm-hmm. But the state language does, afford people, like a home occupation is usually only the resident owner, that's the employees. Mm-hmm. The state language allows up to 5 additional people, and those are typically home businesses when you have additional employees associated with that. We also limit the area of impact, like a home business is limited to 25% 25% square footage of the size of the house. So 25% of your home occupation, home business, related to the size of the house. So you can't get a large scale. A home occupation has to take place within, our definition of home occupation takes place within the house. You can't be outside of the house. Things like that. So square foot, and then parking, home occupations, the lower level is limited to 2 parking spaces. And then the home business, I think it allows for a little bit more parking spaces.
And there's language in your code that requires a home occupation to be accessory to residential use or incidental and subordinate to residential use?
Yes. It's the home occupations sections is in our accessories section of our code. So it is an accessory use. So that's again why for us, the short-term rentals, you have to be on site for that. Because it's accessory to the residence still.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to clarify, with Catherine's proposal, there is no requirement currently at the state level that a home occupation be accessory to a residential use or incidental and subordinate to a residential use on the property. So that is something that is specific to Jackson County and maybe some other counties out there. All right, Ken?
I think that going through these standards like you just did is really interesting, because if we were wanting to have a broader policy discussion, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with having each county adopt their own standards. I mean, this would allow people at a very granular level with each jurisdiction in the state to come up with rules that they think works for their community and their particular farmland, subject to review by the courts, et cetera. So, I mean, this is exactly why maybe this process should be more subject to getting some funding from DLCD in order to do text amendments or policy discussions like they're doing with clear and objective standards, for example. So just another way to approach this that might allow people in the location that they live to actually engage in these discussions.
Yeah. Let's say we do have part of our policy option package this year is our request to reinvigorate the technical assistance program for farm and forest code. We will see what happens with that request. That's something we're very interested in, to provide that, reinvigorate that program to get the money to support counties with code updates, whether they're conforming or otherwise. All right. So I'm curious to hear from sort of feedback from our thoughts from other planners. Nobody has their hand quite up yet. Listening to the discussion, maybe around the idea of a definition, a statewide definition for home occupations, reactions to that. Would that add to your code, or are these some things that are already in your code? What do you think of requiring a home occupation to be accessory to a primary residential use? And what type of clarity might be helpful in how one progresses through the sort of levels of pathway? Just curious about thoughts from planners on the discussion.
I've got some thoughts. I think a definition would be good. What exactly that would be is tough to nail down right now, because home occupation is so broad and specific. But I think a definition would help. One thing that might help our discussion is I'll go through like what we have in our code right now for home occupation. So it's listed under conditional uses for us. So you already have to meet all the conditional use criteria, not force a significant change or increase the cost of accepted farming practices. No adverse impacts, water impacts, things like that, right? And then our code goes on to say that it shall be operated substantially in the dwelling or other buildings normally associated with uses permitted in the zone, but it shall not be authorized in structure accessory to resource use, so no ag exempt structures. It says that you can't assemble or dispatch employees to other locations from the home occupation. Can't do retail or wholesale sales, and you have 5 employee limit. So we use those limits to kind of keep things to an accessory to the dwelling level, right? And if once you start talking about more employees or, you know, large buildings or building something new, it really becomes, okay, you're probably a commercial use, you're probably a processing, you're probably, you know, something else. So we use those sorts of things. There might be a way that the definition could include some of those things. But I also think the substantially in the dwelling or substantially in a structure is a good point, because it's, you know, we've had home occupations. I've had one where a good example was where they said they were going to manufacture sort of like docks and metal components accessory to docks used on the Willamette River. And so I told him, I was like, it needs to be substantially inside the dwelling or another structure. He's got a pole barn on his property. And he's like, oh, yeah, you know, we'll do it fine. We'll be there. We'll just, you know, sometimes some stuff will be left outside while it's getting moved in and out and things like that. I'm like, okay. And we haven't got any code enforcement complaints. So, you know, it's one of those things where the neighbors aren't so mad about it. But when you go by his property, the whole property is lined with basically pre-made docks and boat lifts and things like that. So it's sort of the idea, when you drive by that property, you're going to look at that property and say, well, that's a commercial property, right? But I think the idea of a home occupation is you drive by the property and you're like, well, that just looks like a dwelling. And that's kind of a good litmus test.
All right. Thank you, Austin. That's an interesting example. An example of, like, you know, what can happen afterwards. Maitri?
Yeah, so looking at our code, we have a definition in our home occupation code standard where it calls out that the home occupation is secondary to the residential activity, and that the residential character of the dwelling be maintained. It also calls out that it is a lawful activity to be operated within a dwelling by member or members of the family who occupy the dwelling. And the way the standard is laid out, there's 3 tiers to that. There's a type 1, type 2, and type 3, where type 1 is confined to a dwelling. The type 2 requires an impact analysis, and you may use an accessory structure. And a type 3, we've never really seen a type 3, and that's kind of gives a little more flexibility, where it lets you park a little more, use more space, but we've never really seen that application. So yeah, it kind of breaks it out. And there's also these restrictions that we have, as I mentioned earlier, where there's a limit to the number of employees and the number of customers. That's slightly more for a type 2 than a type 1. And so yeah, that's kind of how it's broken up at Washington County. And it's worked well so far, whether it's been for any kind of use that we know is related to farm use or otherwise. So, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. So we're at about an hour and a half now. So I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break. And if folks do have other thoughts on this topic, when we come back, we'll have a little bit of time to cover that. Otherwise, if there are no additional thoughts on this particular subject, we will move into the discussion on alignment of rectangular templates for forest dwellings, alternative forest dwellings, or template dwellings. All right, so I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes, and we'll come back after a quick break. All right, thanks, folks. All right. A nice little stretch bake. Saria. All right, great. So I see. So let's take so there is time if folks have some more thoughts that they'd like to share about the previous topic, especially, if we haven't heard from you yet today. And then we'll move into a conversation about an aspect of the template test, and we'll explain a little bit about what's behind that. So we do see we have Jeff, Mike, and then Jim with hands raised. So further thoughts on the sort of multi-path permitting topic. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. Very briefly, and I'm going to take off when we start the template test discussion, because that's really outside my expertise, and every time I have looked at it, which has been very rarely, I just kind of scratch my head raw. Hopefully you all can figure it out in a rational way where even I could understand. So anyway, I just want to go back to the Yamhill County example, and I don't know if it really is purely a Yamhill County problem, or if Yamhill County is just a forerunner of what will be a broader problem. But that does relate to what turns into a wine country hotel. And it's very easy for a hotel developer to take an option on farm property, have the farmer apply, for example, for a 9-room bed and breakfast. And when the permit is awarded, then the buyer steps in, takes over the property. Maybe there's a couple of trellises of vines outside each of the rooms. And what you have is just a wine country hotel. And whatever we do, I think we have to address that issue, because that is not intended to be allowed.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So again, a concern around the sort of scope, scale, intensity of home occupations, sort of exceeding what most people think a home occupation might be, and becoming the primary use rather than accessory to a residential use on a property, is what I'm hearing. All right, Mike, and then Jim, and then Charles.
Just add that I think it's very important that we clarify this at the state level and not leave it all up to the counties. And there's many counties, and this is not anything against the planners who are on the call today, who are very expert in using the rules appropriately. But what can happen is, in counties, development interests drive the program. They're the ones that show up, and there would be no farmland left in Hood River County if it was left up to local decision making. So I think that's really a reason it's very important at the state level to have good rules.
All right, thank you, Mike. And so, looking at consistency, it's the program does try to balance, consistency across the state with provisions that allow for local flexibility to adjust the program to the needs of their community and what it looks like on the ground for them. But sometimes consistency at the state level can be very helpful. All right, Jim, and then Austin.
Yeah, and Mike just kind of hit on this, but my experience has been about this consistency element. It's not uncommon for me to get a call from a farmer in one county and saying, the county that I'm in will not allow me to do this certain use, but next door, just 5 miles away across the county line, they can do all this. I don't believe that's fair. I don't believe that's consistent, and they've got a competitive advantage over me. So there is a good argument for getting some more consistency statewide in terms of how some of these land uses are actually authorized in terms of, limitations, conditions, definitions, or the like. And I will remind everybody that yes, local governments implement this, and there is some flexibility there or whatever, but it is a statewide planning program, and agricultural lands don't necessarily recognize political boundaries. Farmers farm in multiple locations. It could be multiple counties, multiple jurisdictions, and there really needs to be some consistency, in my opinion.
All right, thank you, Jim. And so, so highlighting that another benefit of consistency is for clarity, so that there's not competitiveness between jurisdictions where somebody may have a commercial advantage in one county over another based on the local regulations. All right, Austin and then Samantha.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Jim and Mike said. It sounds like, yeah, there's the consistency would help statewide with different people applying for these things and how planners interpret things and look at things. And I think the definition would help get us sort of all on the same track, and then use the criteria there to sort of fit uses into that definition for a home occupation. Yeah, it is interesting to hear the different interpretations, different things and whatnot. I think that's probably prompting a lot of this confusion and whatnot when, you do have people who farm in different counties and places that are, not divided by rivers or highways. It's just a line right there, basically, and there's different uses. So I think that consistency part would help the overall implementation of these rules.
All right, thank you. All right, Samantha and then Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I just share a different perspective from helping applicants across the state. I think folks like local discretion, and it seems like we're shifting farther and farther away from local control. And it's honestly throughout this entire conversation, I understand there was a technical work group. Again, not everyone was included in that. It seems like that's where a lot of the conversation and policy work was already done. But today I didn't hear much from planners identifying these as significant problems. I've heard from other groups who are filing litigation against local government that they think that this is a problem, but I didn't hear much from planners that this was a legitimate problem. And it sounds like local codes are already effectively interpreting statutes to do what works within their community, be in compliance with state law. So again, I will just flag, this kind of feels like using the term clarity or technical clarifications to make some significant changes in policy discretion. And I understand that DLCD has broad authority to implement the planning system, but I think we're kind of splitting hairs here, where state law makes clear that these things were already allowed. These debates, we're not having them in a vacuum. These same groups debated when those bills were passed at the legislature. And these same groups are debating when we're in court interpreting them. And now we're in a rulemaking process, debating them still. And so I just think that it's fine if we want to have these debates. It's fine if we want to have these big policy discussions, but let's actually have them in an inclusive process. We're being upfront about what we're doing and not, keep saying this is about clarity and technical clarifications. I think that's where I keep getting really frustrated, because I'm more than happy to have policy conversations and even be in the minority on that. But it doesn't feel like this process is transparent on what we're actually doing.
All right, thank you, Samantha. Are there any other comments before we move on to template test requirements? Charles, you had your hand up briefly. Was there something that you wanted to add into the conversation?
I think I'm okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right, so again, I would encourage folks, if you have additional thoughts on this topic, if you want to be 100% clear on your perspective, please go ahead and email me any additional comments on the topic that we discussed today. And after this meeting, we will be looking at developing language for discussion on July 12th. That will be our sort of draft rule proposal. All right, so we're going to move into the next topic, and unfortunately, Matri had to leave, and this is something that I know is a concern to Washington County, as well as a couple of the other counties that are on here, and generally speaking. So in forest zones, there is an opportunity for an alternative forest dwelling, which is affectionately referred to as a template test dwelling. And the sort of principle behind a template test dwelling is that if your tract of forest land is located in an area where there's already an established pattern of development, like a certain number of houses and parcels that existed in 1993 when House Bill 3661 was enacted, then you can have another dwelling in that area. The idea being that since it's already kind of developed, that a new dwelling there won't have a significant impact on timber operations or on the cost of fire suppression. So different type of impact on concerns in forest zones than a dwelling that would be out in the middle of the woods, for example. So most template tests involve a square that is centered on the tract and can rotate around. There is an alternative option to place a rectangle, a 160-acre rectangle that is 1 mile long and 1/4 wide, centered again on the subject tract. But instead of being allowed to rotate around, the idea of it was fixed in an alignment with a road or a perennial stream under certain conditions. And so over the past 4 years, our department has received a number of requests actually for guidance from counties on how to achieve alignment of that rectangle to the maximum extent possible with the road or the stream feature, because road and stream features aren't necessarily straight. Often they're very curvy. And quite often, there may be multiple stream segments in different portions of a tract, or that stream may branch like into different areas. And so it makes it challenging to understand how to align that, that template, that rectangular template. And we've seen a couple of situations where alignment of that rectangular template has become a little bit contentious. I saw a couple of comments about centering it. The statute actually already requires that that rectangle be centered on a tract. And after the passage of House Bill 2225 in 2019, the center of the tract is actually defined as the mathematical centroid. And when that change was made in 2019, it became effective at different dates for different counties. We provided a GIS methodology that allows you to do that using GIS. And the alternative is that your applicant can have a surveyor do it as well. So the question really is, and the charge here again was to establish a replicable methodology for aligning that rectangle to the maximum extent possible with that feature. And we've heard a couple of different suggestions, based on some things we've seen in other counties elsewhere. So one of, the counties is an ordinance that requires 2 points of the rectangle be equidistant from the center line of a stream or road. If you have multiple segments of streams, say a stream in this corner, a stream in that corner, that might still be confusing how to do that. We've sort of looked at a GIS methodology that I've sat down and walked through with our GIS analyst. And we've had a couple of other suggestions. So what I'd do is, again, ask some of the county planners to start off on the conversation and sort of maybe describe your approach to the rectangle or challenges that you've had with the rectangle. And then your thoughts on some of the methodologies that have been sort of proposed, or any additional methodologies that you might be interested in proposing. Charles, can I call on you first?
Sure. I put my comments in the record because it's visual on this one. And honestly, I guess I'll prefer some context in what I put in the record. When we use the rectangle, I was looking at the actual lot frontage as to the angle. So the subject parcel and its lot frontage to the road or perennial stream is where you would draw that maximum extent possible. But then when this question came up for Iraq, I reread, the language in the ORS, and it's really talking about so the rectangle itself having the maximum extent possible. And well, the case in the subject example 3 or example D in my comments was an agent basically stretched he averaged out the maximum extent possible of the road by going out like half a mile to be able to average out the road. And so to me, it makes sense to use the maximum extent possible of the 168 acre or 160 acre rectangle, and then draw that line. I put the example in the comments. Unfortunately, I don't have language that is a good way to describe the best way to repeat this going forward. I mean, the equidistant thing, I don't think covers all scenarios that come up. I think that's the problem with that one. So I know this is so hard to do without a visual of mapping, looking at maps. I don't know if you want to bring up my maps and people can respond. I'd be happy to hear what people think of my comments in the record.
Yeah, let me pull up your comments for discussion. And let's see, that was provided because I think it is actually helpful to have a visual. You're right. Let's see. But while I'm doing that, do you want to describe how you how you align the rectangle? Now it's with the road segment that abuts or is within the parcel. Is that right?
The frontage of the parcel abuts, if the parcel itself abuts the road north-south direction, then that's what makes sense to be the maximum extent possible. And maybe that's a wrong interpretation. And because of this other case that came up, it made me reconsider. In the example that I have, the frontage is just a 25-foot. It's not really a flag lot, but it only abuts by 25 feet on this very large parcel, and it created an angle that the applicant didn't like. It didn't capture enough of the lots following the road using that method. So that's where that he used the averaging of the entirety. So the first 3 examples we have here are, I would say that this made sense to me at the beginning. I don't know if you can rotate those, Hillary.
I'm trying. Let's see. I'm old. Let's see. And I can't see my screen because of the share screen. There we go. Let's
So those are examples of lot frontage and the angle to maximizing the extent. And I think the logic that I was using is that you're trying to capture, like you said, the multiple parcels that are the road, you know, I guess historically houses were built alongside roads, right? I mean, the farmhouses and so forth, they didn't build them, you know, away from the road. They were right up next to the roads. And so these lots were created that, and so you would be capturing the lots along the road. And so the lot frontage made sense to me. But on the example, the fourth page, if you go to the fourth one, even though you can see the black line is the lot frontage where it actually abuts the road. It's a bold right there where the hand is, and it's a different angle. It didn't capture the lots on the, you know, that they were trying to capture. That is the mathematical centroid of that. The star is the mathematical centroid of that lot. But it didn't, so they didn't like that angle. But what we settled on was, well, if you use you can see my pencil marks where I naturally extended the line from the short side of the rectangle, then drew a line that made it parallel, and that's the parallel, you know, the average of the road parallel, and then the lot is parallel to that. Or the square is the rectangle, sorry.
Yeah. So the question here is, do you just use that segment of the road or stream that is abutting or within the tract, or do you use the entirety of the road and the stream, maybe that would be within or parallel to, in this particular case, for example, the rectangle that's centered? And so what Charles is saying is that this fat black section here is actually the only section of the road that abuts the subject parcel, and therefore should this rectangle have instead been aligned in more of a northeasterly direction like this. So that's the sort of question that we're grappling with. You know, another version of this question is what happens when there maybe is a road through here, through one corner of the, well, let's say through here, through one portion of the subject track. How do you account for two roads or a road and a section of stream? That is another question that we've gotten quite a bit. So other thoughts from other planners? Lane, I know you guys have a lot of template tests.
We have. A few thoughts. So this measurement actually in the template doubling applications that we've processed, it's my observation that it wasn't terribly or hasn't been terribly common. But we certainly have applied it. We did have a couple of appeals that I'm aware of that dealt with actually a pretty similar situation to the property that's pulled up on the screen, the hearing's official decision talked about the property as being sort of a bit of an anomaly because it was long, it was narrow, it stretched to the north and away from the road, but that this template still had to be created at the center of the property. And initially the applicant had provided a template that was utilizing what the hearings official called sort of the frontage approach. So measuring it in alignment with the property frontage. It did have proportionally more frontage than the property up on the screen. And then in the hearings official requested that the applicants provide a template aligned with the road using the length of the template. So they referred to that as the template length approach. And both of them were fairly similar and met the standards. And then I believe the applicant provided an alignment that was slightly rotated, and there was another party who provided an alternative template, and the hearings official found that those met the applicants' templates all met the standards in that case. So while it appears that the hearings official was looking at the template length as a better alternative, the issue didn't necessarily have to be decided because the test was met, and the even the alternative provided by another party didn't conflict with those tests. Just looking at that example, it struck me in the draft language that it could be challenging, or in the packet, the proposal that the template area be set back no further from the road or stream than the setback required in the local land use ordinance. That could be an issue for a property like this that is extends further away from the road, because the center of the tract was quite a bit north.
Yeah.
And also the hearings official decision talked a little bit about how they weren't able to locate any legislative history regarding the rectangle template mapping, but that the intent might have been to allow a property owner to take advantage of the development along the roadway, and using certain measurements might present a challenge to capturing some of the development along the roadway if that was the legislative intent.
We do have some documentation of the legislative history there, and it was the intent that the square be able to spin and that the rectangle be static. And so the not being able to spin was and the static nature of the rectangle was the trade-off for having the flexibility of being able to use either the spinning square or a static rectangle, which is interesting. Yeah. And does your code in Lane have anything that clarifies how to align the rectangle, or do you have the statutory language in your code?
We have the language directly out of statute.
Yeah. Okay.
The last thing I'll mention really quickly is in the hearings official cases, it didn't appear that they were utilizing an equidistant approach. So that might have been problematic in those cases.
How about other counties? Austin, have you encountered this in Marion?
Yeah, so we haven't had, I wouldn't say we've had a lot of issues with these. We do a fair amount of template tests, and they seem to go off without a hitch. Generally, we're able to align things and get people what they want is generally what comes out of us. I don't know if that's just happens to be the density we have out in the mountains and it just works for us. But we're pretty similar to how Charles does it. What we do is basically, like in this example, it's up on the screen right here, is I would probably align the rectangle just like this. It is to the maximum extent aligned with the road as I would see it, and I think a regular person would likely see it. So we use, how does the road, what is the direction of the road as it's moving along the property? And then since you're tied to that centroid right there, we just rotate the centroid such that that rectangle is trying to be aligned with that road as much as we can. So that's basically our interpretation of it. We haven't had any appeals on it. We haven't had we haven't had issues with it on our end over here. So I'm actually sort of, I would leave the language as it is. But also I'm not experiencing issues that other people may have. So I'm not necessarily coming from a place of needing further clarification on this. But so far it's worked out. And we haven't had a lot of, most of the time for us, it's the road. It just seems the streams, we never really align with the stream very often. It's a road. And we are sort of right in between Charles, where we just rotate, get it like that.
Okay, and you line it not with the abutting portion of the road, but with the portion of the road that's commensurate with the rectangle. And how do you determine the bearing of the road, the bearing is the sort of the directional aspect of that road segment?
So I go with what's in front of me. Like here, it looks like, I think the map is turned, so we're looking at, I think, an east to west road that's kind of appearing north to south now.
Yeah.
So all of our roads are classified as, in our old Rolodex, we've got where the roads are running, technically north to south, east to west, whatever. But I take how is it running in front of the property in my study area, basically, is just how we look at this.
Mm-hmm. And do you just kind of eyeball it, or do you apply some sort of calculation to the?
We don't apply any calculations.
Okay.
I would say, this is aligned, and then don't do any further calculations.
Mm-hmm. How about other counties or other folks who have been involved in appeals of the alignment methodology? Mike, did you want to talk about the evidence that you provided or the comments that you provided?
Sure, Hillary, thank you. Yeah, we had an example in Hood River County where it was not really clear. The road was very curvy. The applicant thought it was one way, the staff thought it was another. He appealed the decision of the staff to the planning commission, and they supported staff, and then it was appealed to the county commission and maybe beyond that. I can't remember right now, but it does show a need to have a clear and objective method. And Charles's method he brought, or his example here, I didn't imagine this one. It's very complicated, and it can be. And my recommended way would not work here. And so I see that there's a flaw in that. And I think though one of the ways, if the rectangle is truly the center of the rectangle is the center of the parcel, then two corners is enough. And I think that's what Charles did here was two corners where his pencil line is were equidistant from the road or stream. I think that does work. So I think, and the other method though that was recommended was the GIS methodology. I think that also works, where there's a true bearing calculated that can be calculated better than we can eyeball it. So I'm for either one of those methods, but I think it's definitely got to be done because examples do come up where it's really hard to tell, and it should be done to the maximum extent possible.
Mm-hmm. And we have also had some contentious cases in Clatsop, in Washington, and some tricky ones out east. I'm trying to remember if it was Morrow. Megan, was it you that had this question a year or so ago, or was it Tamara in Morrow County?
It wasn't us. I think it must have
Okay.
been Tamara. We haven't really had any issues with the template test. We haven't had since I've been here, and I haven't seen any previous applications where somebody wanted to align it with the road. We do a lot of the mapping for applicants ourselves, and I know a lot of other eastern counties have minimal, if any, GIS skills or tools available to them. And so I just worry that the methodology would be problematic if somebody wanted that from one of those counties.
Mm-hmm. And so that was one of my other questions. So current statute requires centering based on the mathematical centroid. That's in statute currently. And so that can be done by hiring a surveyor. It can also be done fairly quickly through GIS. And I'm curious about other folks, particularly planners, about using a GIS methodology to calculate the bearing. I think it took me about 20 minutes to do that using GIS. I'm curious about your thoughts on using that kind of a methodology if that was a direction to go with this.
I have decent GIS skills and I haven't used that methodology before. The center is pretty easy to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about other folks? Like Amber or Alyssa?
We also use GIS currently to locate the centroid in many cases. We do that to verify where the centroid is, and we can take a look at that with the applicant as well. We have not used it, as far as I know, for the rectangle measurement yet. We could possibly look into that, but I will note that currently we rely on GIS staff, and then we have one staff member in our office that has GIS software. So for all planners to have that be available, there could be some resource considerations with that.
Right. I'm curious about that. And I think, apologies, is a little bit late. We had Austin and then Charles.
Yeah, so lucky for us in Marion County, we had already been using the centroid to calculate. The way we do it here is our GIS team many years ago basically set up a function for us that's just already on our planning map. We just press a button, it loads up a template test report, we click the parcel, it calculates the centroid, it makes the rectangle or square, whichever one we choose. We align it and then hit go, and it calculates all the parcels and the dwellings for us right there. So you can do it without having to be a GIS genius, but we did have to have a team put that in place and then do ongoing maintenance and things on that. But it makes it easy in that way for us that the tool's already built out and we don't really have to be technical about it.
Mm-hmm. All right, and Charles?
Yeah, once again, Austin, I'm right there. That's what we do too. I make these maps for I'm the planner that makes the maps, even though I use the tools from GIS, which is above my abilities, honestly. So I need to try this methodology. I didn't get time to see and work with our GIS team to see how difficult that is to make a tool that will do that automatically. But yeah, we've been using the centroid for years now, a mathematical centroid tool. So that works great. And I'm assuming that this methodology that you have here, Hillary, could be made into a tool as well and function easily for us.
It does involve creating a line along the features that you are interested in. So if there's multiple streams and roads, you would make lines along all of those and then turn those vertices, the vertices in the line, into points, and then use the calculate bearing function to get the bearing for each of those line segments, and then average the bearing of all of those line segments is essentially how it would work in GIS. And that would come up with a sort of average direction of equidistant line segments for all of the features that you're considering within the tract or abutting the tract. Mm-hmm.
So I guess it'll be a homework assignment. I'll try to have comments related to that component of it for next time.
If we did go in that direction, what kind of technical support would you want from the agency?
I think the tool that Austin mentioned sounds great. If DLCD could produce that for all the counties, that would be awesome.
Right.
Maybe my GIS people should talk to some other counties potentially in the interim, or I don't know, it might be an idea. I don't know how easily they can package that tool and send it or whatnot. It's a good idea though.
Yeah, one of the concerns that I have, so I'm using ArcMap. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but there's also ArcGIS Pro that eventually our county will have to move to, and the tools are in ArcMap and don't translate, as I understand it, to Dark Pro as easily. So I mean that's a consideration of what version
people are using.
GIS people are using, folks are using. But if there's the tools that you guys can create at the state, that'd be awesome.
Okay. So I'm hearing some votes for leaving as is, hearing some votes for equidistant at the corners. Curious about feedback on GIS methodologies. I'm going to ask about the definition of a road as well. And so this has been a concern in a couple of counties. What constitutes a road for purposes of alignment of the rectangle? And particularly, does a private driveway qualify as a road? Or do you apply whatever definition that you have in your ordinance for road here? What do you all do?
A built and maintained public right of way.
Okay.
That's
That's your definition in your code.
Yeah, not in our code, but that's what we use. I mean, it'd be a public right of way, not a private road, not an easement, not a driveway. And if it's just a random leftover right of way hanging out there that's not improved, we wouldn't take that either. We'd actually take a traveled right of way. But this hasn't even come up for us really. It's always works out on a right of way. So I don't have basically further comments regarding that.
All right, great. Thank you, Austin. Charles?
Yeah, I mean, we use a road over which the public has a right of use that is a matter of public record.
Okay. So similar to the statutory definition proposed. Yeah. Okay.
So I guess that would be my question in your consideration. You're talking about not including ODF or logging road. You say, you don't say ODF, you say not including logging roads. So if it's an ODF road, that I think those are public roads.
So
Is that part of your question?
So we're looking at the statutory definition of road that applies to a lot of record dwellings, right? And applying that to template test dwellings as well, because we've had expressions of concern that we've heard some concern from counties that about people proposing that driveways, for example, be used here. And so the definition of road at 368 001 is hold on, I'm just pulling it up to read here real quick. Should have had it open earlier. The entire right-of-way of any public or private way that provides ingress or egress to a property by means of vehicle or other means that provides travel between places or between places by means of vehicle. So that's the general definition of a road. A public road, which is the definition for lot of record dwellings, is a road over which the public has a right of use that is a matter of public record. And so we would suggest using that definition, which is consistent with a lot of record definition rather than a broader definition. So if it is a logging road, an ODF logging road that is a public road, which the public has the right to use, then that would meet that definition. If it is a private logging road, which the public does not have a right to use, that is a matter of public record, then that would not meet that definition. And you wouldn't use it for alignment of a rectangle. So any other thoughts on the road question? Would this conflict with anything that anyone has in some way? Does it make it clearer what a road is? Okay. Let's see. I'm going to ask, is Alyssa, are you still on? Do you have thoughts on the alignment methodology? Nope. Okay. I think we must have lost her as well as Maitri. Any other questions about the proposal or thoughts or concerns about this one? Rob?
Yeah, I just had a question. When I'm certainly not an expert on these, but when I read the rule, it says when the lot is adjacent to a road or stream, and this one is adjacent to the stream, river, along more of its length than it is the road. So why are we trying to align it with the road and not the river?
So it
And I
might be,
recognize in this case, it doesn't make a lot of difference, but I can see other examples it might.
yeah. So in order to qualify for alignment with the stream, it has to be at least 60 acres. So it's possible that this is not a 60-acre parcel, and therefore only the road alignment is at issue. If it is 60 acres and there is a perennial stream, then it could be aligned with the road or the stream.
Right. This is less than 60 acres. If it was larger, I guess it doesn't say you have to use one or the other. You can use either.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, it can get confusing. Yeah. And then if the stream has multiple branches, how do you determine when it's appropriately lined? And that we had that issue with Clatsop where there were multiple stream segments bisecting the tract and going in different directions. And so it became very confusing to know how to orient the rectangle in that particular case. Yep. Okay. Well, I think it would be really helpful if particularly planners or anyone else who has GIS resources wanted to take a quick look at that methodology and provide us feedback on how difficult that seems to accomplish for you, how that works with the versions of ArcGIS that you have, what kind of support you would want from the agency if we went that route. And then, whether you would prefer to see no change or one of the other clarifications like the equidistant from the points of the rectangle and clarification on whether the alignment is to the abutting segment of road or a segment of road that is sort of commensurate with the length of the rectangle. I'll send those out as questions, unless there's additional thoughts on those topics. Mike?
Larry, Mike has his hand up.
Yeah, so are there situations where you would have several streams and several roads and you would have to create a bearing on all of them and then your methodology averages those bearings? That's what you're saying, Hillary, is?
That's what we looked at in some of these cases. So looking at bearing calculations for the multiple segments that were within the parcel seemed like the cleanest, most technical and clear way of obtaining that bearing.
So
that direction
there wouldn't be a
alignment.
way where it might be simpler if you could say the principal road or the principal stream, but you know, that's another layer of complexity, but
Another layer of definition, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Like which feature is more salient or predominant.
Yeah.
Austin?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think the multiple stream road calculation would be probably pretty taxing on local staff in GIS. I think it's not impossible, but it'd be hard and be a big lift. And I think we'd probably see some technical difficulties for a while. But that's my forethought on that.
Okay. All right, that's useful feedback there. But again, yeah, if you want to double check with your GIS staff, and that would be really helpful feedback for us as we're thinking about that.
Yeah,
all right.
Would it also be helpful if there was some wording in there about the multiple streams or roads, because there's really no wording in there about that.
That's a really good suggestion as well. So in a case where you have a road and a stream, a road and multiple streams, like what do you align that to?
I think that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Because right now that's up to the discretion of the county. And have you encountered that situation, Charles, where there's multiple features to pick to align with?
Not off the top of my head, but I did notice it says stream, and I'd want to make sure it's clarified that the perennial stream, because we do have questions on that often as well, a perennial stream or just a stream. So I think the language should, follow the statute and say perennial stream.
Mhm.
That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Any other comments or questions about this particular topic? Blair?
So I'm going to enrage all the people who don't like policy discussions here, especially on this very technical discussion that we're having. But it does seem crazy that we're trying to figure out how to allow more private homes in forest zones in Oregon now with the wildfire. It just seems like it needed to be said.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So if there's no more questions on that right now, if something does occur to you, we do want to hear it. So please, send your comments and feedback along to us on this topic. So as far as next steps, as I said, the staff over here at DLCD is going to be spending the next couple of weeks finalizing proposed rule language. That will be the subject of discussion at our July 12th meeting, in addition to the fiscal impact statement that goes along with that set of proposed rule language. So we will endeavor to get that sort of information for you as soon as possible so you can digest it and think about it. We're also, LCDC asked us to have a conversation about replacement dwelling standards as well. And so that will be also a topic of consideration at our July 12th meeting. So it is a lot to cover in our last meeting. And so we're hoping to get that packet out in time for you to provide some written comments before the meeting, be prepared for a conversation at that meeting, and again, get feedback in from everybody on that proposal. So after our July meeting, we will be working on filing notice. And there will be a hearing, the first hearing before LCDC at the end of September. So there'll be an opportunity to read the staff report and file public comments at that September hearing. And it's possible that we may meet again after that first hearing. So we will send out a doodle poll probably sometime in July to get something on people's calendars in early October as a placeholder meeting in case we do need to meet again after that LCDC hearing. Public comment will close around October 15th after the September public hearing. And then the final hearing for rule adoption would be at the beginning of December. So that's the schedule as it is currently. I know that there's some scheduling maybe issues with LCDC, but currently that's the schedule that we are on and what to expect on this rulemaking over the next couple of months. If you do have any questions, feel free obviously to give us a call. You can, reach out to me or to Gordon, and we're happy to discuss any concerns about the process with you. Please provide any additional written feedback on any of the topics that we've covered so far. So if you do have comments that you have on topics we covered earlier, such as codification of case law standards, please get those in. Again, we're going to be re-reviewing everything that we've received over the past couple months and considering it carefully as we go ahead and prepare the proposed rule language for discussion in July. So that's what to expect a little bit over the next couple of months. Are there any questions about next steps or what is coming up or how to participate? Nope. And again, I would extend that opportunity to provide public comment in this rack phase to anybody who might be following along online as well. And anybody who is following along will also have the opportunity to participate in the LCDC process as well that's coming up this fall. All right. Well, with that, we can close out a little bit early again today. Thank you all very much for your time and effort volunteering on here. The feedback has been really helpful. Okay. Thanks all, and we'll see you on July 12th.